Megawatts on your mind from Lighthief. We build it, we run it, we know what works, real projects, real returns. The renewable energy podcast that doesn't waste your time. Let's go.
Hello, and welcome to what I'm told will be the first of many conversations about renewable energy. I'm the voice of Lighthief. Not a person exactly, but then again, we're a company that builds solar farms and wind projects across Europe, so perhaps being slightly abstract is rather on brand. Now, before you worry that you've stumbled into another corporate marketing exercise, let me assure you, this isn't that. We're not here to tell you how brilliant we are, though we like to think we're reasonably competent. We're here because after years of building photovoltaic farms, maintaining them, constructing wind projects, and yes, even wrestling with biogas plants from Poland to Kazakhstan, we've accumulated what the British might call a few thoughts on the matter. This podcast is for investors, developers, and anyone who's ever looked at a field and thought, yes, but what if we covered it with solar panels? It's for people who understand that renewable energy is both the future and a proper headache at times. Over the coming episodes, we'll be talking about O&M, that's operations and maintenance for the uninitiated, which is rather like being a doctor for solar farms. We'll discuss EPC work, which is how these things actually get built. We'll explore how to make money in this sector, and more importantly, how not to accidentally burn through your cash like it's fossil fuel. But for today, this first episode, let's take a step back. Let's talk about where we are. The state of renewables in Europe and beyond. Solar, wind, biogas. The whole renewable orchestra, if you will, and I promise you it's more interesting than it sounds. So, let's start with the obvious. Renewable energy is growing. I know, shocking revelation. But here's what's actually interesting. It's not growing in the way people expected 5 years ago, and certainly not in the way politicians promised it would. The European Union, bless them, has set incredibly ambitious targets. Climate neutrality by 2050, at least 42.5% of energy from renewables by 2030. Noble goals, achievable goals even. But, and there's always a but, the path there is rather more complicated than drawing a nice upward-sloping line on a PowerPoint presentation. In 2024, we saw something quite remarkable. Renewable energy capacity additions hit record levels globally. Solar alone added over 440 gigawatts worldwide. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to adding the entire electricity capacity of Germany in 1 year. Mind you, most of that was in China, but we'll get to that. Europe added about 56 gigawatts of solar in 2024. Germany led the pack, followed by Spain and Poland. Yes, Poland, where Lighthief happens to have its roots, proving that even countries historically dependent on coal can have a renewable awakening when the economics make sense. But here's where it gets interesting from a practitioner's perspective. Adding capacity and adding reliable capacity are two different things. Anyone can bolt solar panels onto a field. We've seen it done badly more times than I'd care to count. The question is whether those panels will still be producing efficiently in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. That's where O&M comes in. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Wind had a more complicated year. Offshore wind, particularly in the North Sea, continues to expand at a rather impressive clip. The UK, Germany, and Denmark are building what amounts to industrial-scale wind farms out in those gray, choppy waters. Onshore wind, however, faces permitting challenges that make Brexit negotiations look straightforward. More on that in a moment. And biogas? Well, biogas is the underdog of the renewable family. It's not sexy like solar, not dramatic like offshore wind, but it's there, quietly churning away, turning agricultural waste into energy. In countries like Italy, Germany, and increasingly in Poland, biogas plants are proving that sometimes the answer to our energy problems smells rather like a farm, which, to be fair, is where most of it comes from. Let's talk about solar, or as we call it in the industry when we're trying to sound more intelligent than we are, photovoltaics. PV. Solar has become the poster child of renewable energy, and frankly, it deserves the attention. The cost decline has been nothing short of extraordinary. In 2010, installing a megawatt of solar cost about 3 to 4 million euro. Today, under 600,000, depending on where you're building. That's not a typo. The cost has dropped by roughly 85 to 90% in 15 years. This is why you're seeing solar farms pop up everywhere from the sunny fields of Andalusia to Poland. Yes, Poland, where the weather is, shall we say, less than Mediterranean. But here's the thing. Solar technology has improved so dramatically that even relatively gray climates make economic sense now. We've built projects in southern Spain where the irradiation is excellent, over 1,800 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. Beautiful. But we've also built in central Poland, where you're looking at maybe 1,100 kilowatt hours per square meter. And you know what? Both projects work. Both make money. The Polish one just needs slightly more careful financial engineering and better O&M practices because every percentage point of performance matters more. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, China. Or rather the solar module manufacturing capacity of China, which is absolutely staggering. Chinese manufacturers now produce roughly 80 to 90% of the world's solar modules. They've built such enormous manufacturing capacity that module prices they've collapsed. In a good way, if you're buying modules. In a less good way, if you're a European manufacturer trying to compete. We saw module prices drop to record lows in 2024, under 10 euro cents per watt for some crystalline silicon modules. 10 years ago, they were over €1 per watt. This is fantastic for project economics, but it does mean that European manufacturing is barely hanging on. The IRA in America is trying to revive U.S. manufacturing with subsidies, and Europe has its own initiatives. But let's be honest, the horse has rather bolted on this one. What does this mean for investors and developers? Well, cheap modules mean better project IRRs, which should mean more projects getting financed. And it does, to an extent. But it also means that the competitive advantage has shifted. It's no longer about who can source cheap panels. Everyone can do that. It's about who can build efficiently, who can maintain systems properly, and who can navigate the absolute maze of permits and regulations across different European markets. Here's something we've learned from building across multiple countries. Every market is different. Spain has sun and good regulation, but can be bureaucratically challenging. Italy has excellent feed-in tariff legacy projects, but newer merchant projects face basis risk. Poland has improving support schemes, but grid connection can be character building. Cyprus, where we also operate, has abundant sun, but limited grid capacity. Ukraine, yes, we work in Ukraine, had a booming solar sector before 2022, and remarkably, many of those projects are still operating, though obviously, circumstances are rather difficult. The point is, solar is no longer just about panels and inverters. It's about local knowledge, grid connections, land rights, political risk, currency risk, and about 100 other things that don't appear in a typical feasibility study. And then there's agrivoltaics, which is rather a fancy term for putting solar panels in fields and still farming underneath them. This is genuinely interesting because it addresses one of the main criticisms of solar: land use. In Italy and France, we're seeing more and more projects that combine agriculture with energy production. Sheep grazing under panels, crops growing in the shade. It sounds a bit mad, but it works. The sheep keep the grass down, free maintenance, and the crops actually benefit from partial shade in hot climates. There's also floating solar, or photovoltaics, if you want to sound like you're trying too hard. Putting solar panels on reservoirs and lakes reduces water evaporation, keeps the panels cooler, which improves efficiency and doesn't use any land. We're seeing this in Portugal, the Netherlands, and increasingly in Southern Europe. Though I must say, installing and maintaining solar panels on water does add a certain aquatic complexity to the work. But here's the real challenge with solar. It's intermittent. Shocking, I know. The sun doesn't shine at night. Who knew? This means that as solar penetration increases, you need either storage, which is getting cheaper but still expensive, or you need grid flexibility, or you need to curtail production, which is basically throwing away free electricity. None of these options are perfect. Battery storage is improving rapidly. Lithium-ion prices have dropped considerably, and now we're seeing 2 to 4 hour battery systems attached to solar farms becoming almost standard in some markets. But here's the thing. Batteries are expensive, they degrade over time, and the economics only work if you can capture enough price arbitrage or provide grid services. It's not a magic solution. It's another complex financial calculation. Right, let's move on to wind. Wind power, the technology that launched 1,000 metaphors about renewable energy. Tilting at windmills has taken on a rather different meaning since Don Quixote's time. Investors still have significant appetite for wind. And by appetite, I mean they're willing to deploy serious capital into projects that involve placing massive turbines in fields, or more excitingly, in the middle of the North Sea, where the weather makes a British summer look positively balmy. Let's divide this into 2 categories: onshore and offshore. They're completely different beasts. Onshore wind has been around for decades now. The technology is mature, reliable, and frankly, a bit boring, which in the energy world is actually a compliment. Boring means predictable returns. Boring means bankable. Boring means your CFO can sleep at night. The modern onshore turbines are genuinely impressive pieces of engineering. We're talking about machines with rotor diameters of 150 plus meters, hub heights of 100 plus meters. These aren't the quaint little 3-blade spinners you might have seen in the 1990s. These are industrial-scale machines that can generate 4 to 6 megawatts each. The problem with onshore wind in Europe isn't technology, it's people. Or more specifically, local opposition, permitting challenges, and what I can only describe as a Kafkaesque regulatory environment in some countries. In Germany, for instance, getting permits for onshore wind can take 5 to 7 years. Yes, years. By the time you've got your permits, you've forgotten why you wanted to build the project in the first place. Spain and Poland have been more accommodating recently, which is why you're seeing increased activity there. But even in favorable markets, you're dealing with environmental impact assessments, bird migration studies, noise complaints from residents 3 kilometers away, who suddenly can't sleep, despite the fact that they live next to a motorway and endless community consultations. Here's a practical observation. Onshore wind projects succeed or fail based on local community engagement. We've seen projects stall because developers treated it purely as a technical exercise and forgot that people actually live near these turbines. The successful projects involve the community early, offer local benefit schemes, and treat objections seriously rather than dismissively. Now, offshore wind, that's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean eye-wateringly expensive, but also increasingly essential for Europe's energy transition. The North Sea has become something of a renewable energy hotspot. The UK has been leading this charge for over a decade. Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium are all building substantial offshore capacity. And the turbines being installed now are absolutely enormous. We're talking 15-megawatt machines with rotor diameters of over 230 meters. Each blade is longer than a football pitch. It's rather absurd when you think about it. The economics of offshore wind have improved dramatically, partly due to scale and partly due to technological innovation. Fixed-bottom offshore wind in good locations can now compete without subsidies in some markets. Floating offshore wind, which allows you to go into deeper waters, is still more expensive, but coming down the cost curve rapidly. But let's be honest about the challenges. Offshore wind is logistically complex. You're installing massive structures in marine environments, often 30 to 40 kilometers from shore. You need specialized vessels, weather windows, and a supply chain that can handle the scale. The O&M on offshore wind is particularly challenging. You can't just drive to the site when something breaks. You need boats or helicopters, and you're weather dependent. There have been some well-publicized issues with offshore wind projects in recent years. Cost overruns, supply chain problems, inflation eating into margins. Several developers have walked away from projects or renegotiated power purchase agreements. This has made some investors nervous, which is understandable when you're talking about multi-billion euro projects. But here's the thing. The fundamentals are still strong. Europe needs offshore wind to hit its climate targets. The technology works. The resource is excellent. Wind speeds offshore are higher and more consistent than onshore. It's just a question of getting the project economics right, managing the risks properly, and having realistic expectations about timelines and returns. From our perspective as EPC contractors who might work on wind projects, the key is discipline, proper site assessments, realistic cost estimates, adequate contingencies, and experienced contractors. We've seen projects go wrong because someone underestimated the complexity or cut corners to win a bid. In offshore wind, cutting corners doesn't save money. It costs more money later when things go wrong in the middle of the North Sea. And then there's the grid connection issue. You can build the most efficient wind farm in the world, but if you can't connect it to the grid, or if the grid can't handle the capacity, you've just built a very expensive tourist attraction. grid reinforcement is lagging behind generation capacity across much of Europe. This is becoming a serious bottleneck. Section 4. Biogas, the underappreciated workhorse. 8 to 10 minutes. Right. Let's talk about biogas, the Cinderella of renewable energy. Not glamorous, often smelly, but quietly getting on with the job. Biogas is what happens when you take organic waste, agricultural waste, food waste, sewage sludge, that sort of thing, and let it decompose in an oxygen-free environment. The bacteria produce methane, which you can burn to generate electricity or heat, or upgrade to biomethane, and inject into the gas grid. It's renewable energy with a rather agricultural character. The brilliant thing about biogas is that it's dispatchable. Unlike solar and wind, which produce when nature decides, biogas plants can run continuously. They provide baseload power. In an energy system increasingly dominated by intermittent renewables, having dispatchable renewable capacity is genuinely valuable. Germany has been the European leader in biogas for years. They have over 9,000 biogas plants. Italy is second with about 2,000. Poland, where we operate, has been growing its biogas sector, though it's still relatively small compared to its potential. But, and you knew there was a but coming, biogas faces some significant challenges. First, the economics. Biogas plants are capital intensive. You need digesters, gas storage, generators or upgrading equipment, and a reliable supply of feedstock. The payback period can be quite short, sometimes well under 5 years, but you're dependent on support schemes or favorable gas prices. When gas prices were high in 2022 to 2023, biogas economics looked fantastic. Now that prices have normalized somewhat, margins are tighter, but still there. Second, feedstock availability and quality. A biogas plant is only as good as what you put into it. If you're relying on agricultural waste, you need to ensure consistent supply. If you're using energy crops like maize, you're competing with food production, which creates ethical concerns and regulatory challenges. Some countries have limits on how much energy crop you can use in biogas production. Third, regulation. Biogas regulation varies enormously across Europe. Some countries have excellent feed-in tariffs or renewable gas certificates. Others treat biogas with suspicion. And the environmental regulations around biogas plants, particularly regarding emissions and waste handling, can be quite stringent. But despite these challenges, biogas is moving forward. And I'd argue it should move forward more quickly. Here's why. Biogas solves multiple problems simultaneously. It generates renewable energy, yes, but it also deals with organic waste that would otherwise go to landfill or be burned. It can reduce methane emissions from agriculture. It produces digestate, which is an excellent fertilizer, reducing the need for synthetic fertilizers. And in countries with gas grids, biomethane can replace natural gas in existing infrastructure. We're seeing interesting developments in biomethane particularly. Several European countries are setting targets for biomethane production. France wants 14% of its gas consumption to come from biomethane by 2030. Italy has similar ambitions. This is driving investment in upgrading facilities that can clean biogas to natural gas quality and inject it into the grid. There's also increasing interest in biogas from wastewater treatment plants. Cities produce enormous amounts of sewage sludge, which has traditionally been a disposal problem. Now it's increasingly being seen as an energy resource. Not the most pleasant conversation topic over dinner, admittedly, but quite sensible from an energy and waste management perspective. The technical challenges with biogas are different from solar or wind. It's more chemical engineering than electrical engineering. You're dealing with biological processes, which can be temperamental. Temperature control, pH levels, feedstock mixing ratios, it all matters. The O&M on a biogas plant requires different skills than maintaining a solar farm. From a practical standpoint, biogas projects succeed when you have three things: reliable feedstock, favorable regulation, and experienced operators. We've seen projects struggle because one of these three pillars was weak. A beautifully engineered biogas plant is useless if your maize supplier suddenly decides to sell to a higher bidder, or if the regulatory support scheme changes unexpectedly. But when done right, biogas can be excellent. Steady, predictable revenue from renewable energy. Local economic benefits, particularly in rural areas. Waste valorization. It's just not as flashy as covering a hillside with solar panels or putting up enormous wind turbines. It's more earthy, literally. So we've talked about the technologies. Now let's talk about reality, because there's often a rather significant gap between the two. Here's what we've learned from actually building and maintaining renewable energy projects across Europe and beyond. First, location matters more than you think. Not just in terms of wind speeds or solar irradiation, though obviously those are important, but in terms of grid availability, permitting environment, political stability, local labor costs, and supply chain logistics. A project in Spain is completely different from a project in Kazakhstan, even if the technology is identical. We've seen excellent wind resources in locations where you simply couldn't build a viable project due to grid constraints. We've seen solar projects with mediocre irradiation outperform projects in sunnier locations because the O&M was better. Geography is destiny in renewable energy, but it's more complex than just looking at a resource map. Second, O&M is where projects live or die long-term. I know I keep coming back to this, but that's because we're an O&M company and we see this constantly. Anyone can build a solar farm. Building it well, maintaining it properly, and ensuring it produces at or above expected levels for 25 years, that's much harder. We've taken over O&M contracts for projects that were underperforming by 10 to 15% compared to expectations. Not because the equipment was faulty, but because the previous O&M was inadequate. Dirty panels, inverter faults not addressed promptly, vegetation management neglected, monitoring systems not configured properly. Death by 1,000 cuts. Proper O&M isn't glamorous. It's cleaning panels at the right frequency. It's having spare parts available. It's responding quickly when something breaks. It's analyzing performance data to catch degradation early. It's boring, methodical work. But it's the difference between a project that returns 8% IRR and one that returns 5% IRR. Over 25 years, that difference is enormous. Third, regulations and politics matter as much as technology. The best designed project can be killed by regulatory changes. We've seen it happen. Feed-in tariffs reduced retroactively, grid connection charges increased, permitting requirements tightened. This is particularly true in markets with political instability or frequent policy changes. Risk assessment for renewable projects needs to account for political and regulatory risk not just technical and financial risk. This is why experienced developers often prefer slightly lower returns in stable markets over higher returns in volatile markets. Fourth, the supply chain is more complex than it appears. The renewable energy supply chain is global, complex, and occasionally fragile. Most solar modules come from China. Many inverters come from Chinese manufacturers, though European and American brands exist. Balance of system components, cables, mounting structures, transformers, come from various manufacturers across Europe and Asia. During 2021 to 2022, we saw massive supply chain disruptions. Module prices increased for the first time in over a decade. Shipping costs exploded. Lead times stretched from weeks to months. Projects were delayed, economics changed mid-development, and some projects became unviable. The lesson: supply chain planning and risk management are critical. Having multiple suppliers, understanding lead times, having contingencies for delays. It's not exciting, but it's necessary. Fifth, grid connection is the secret bottleneck. Everyone focuses on generation capacity, but grid capacity often lags far behind. In many European markets, getting a grid connection can take longer than building the actual project. Grid operators are overwhelmed with connection requests. Reinforcement is slow and expensive. Curtailment is increasingly common in areas with high renewable penetration. This is a problem that requires solutions at the transmission system operator level and governmental level. But for developers and investors, it means that projects with secured grid connections have real value. Grid availability is becoming as important as wind or solar resource quality. So, where do we go from here? The renewable energy transition is happening. Not smoothly, not as quickly as some would like, and with more complications than anyone anticipated, but it is happening. Solar and wind capacity will continue to grow. Biogas will continue to develop, particularly as biomethane policies mature. Storage will become increasingly important and increasingly common. The opportunities are substantial. For investors willing to understand the complexities, accept the risks, and commit for the long term, renewable energy offers reasonable returns with societal benefits. For developers who can navigate the permitting maze, manage supply chains, and execute projects efficiently, there's work aplenty. For O&M providers, well, we might be biased, but we think the O&M market will continue to grow significantly. The challenges are also substantial. Grid constraints, regulatory uncertainty, supply chain risks, technology evolution, market volatility. This isn't a simple industry. Anyone telling you it is either lying or doesn't understand it properly. But that's rather what makes it interesting, isn't it? If it were easy, everyone would be doing it successfully. The fact that it's difficult means there's value in experience, expertise, and execution. Which brings me to what we'll be discussing in future episodes. We're going to dive deep into O&M. What actually happens when you're maintaining a solar farm or wind project? What goes wrong, how to prevent it, why it matters financially. We'll talk about building projects in different European markets, the practical realities of EPC work, how to avoid the common mistakes that burn through cash and destroy returns. We'll discuss how to actually make money in renewable energy, the financial structures, the risk management, the operational details that separate profitable projects from marginal ones. And we'll be honest about the challenges. The things that can go wrong, the risks that aren't in the glossy presentations, because we'd rather you understand the reality than be surprised by it later. This is Lighthief's perspective, the voice of a company that actually builds and maintains these projects across Europe, from sunny Spain to rather less sunny Poland, from established markets to frontier markets. We're practitioners, not theorists. We make mistakes, we learn from them, and occasionally we get things right. So if you're an investor considering renewable energy, a developer planning projects, or someone just interested in how this industry actually works, rather than how it's supposed to work, I hope you'll join us for the next episodes. The renewable energy transition is the biggest infrastructure build-out in human history. It's going to happen over the next few decades, whether we like it or not. Climate change and energy security have rather forced the issue. We might as well understand it properly, approach it intelligently, and perhaps make some money while doing something useful. Thank you for listening to this first episode. Until next time, this is Lighthief, reminding you that renewable energy is both simpler and more complicated than anyone tells you, usually at the same time.